Hi, this is Eric. This is our lecture, which is going to lead us into our shoestring workshop, where we're going to make a clone of the Bootstrap library. So we're going to get very comfortable with CSS and some other technologies. So first of all, let's just look at a diagram here, which helps us explain why CSS is so important. When we end up combining HTML, which is really our markup and our content, and CSS, which dictates our style rules, the result of what we end up getting is going to be our layout. So it's the combination of these two things together. And it's something that's very important for a couple of different reasons. One of them is that you're building an application. You want your application to look nice, right? You want people to enjoy using it. Also, if you want to do that, the only game in town is going to be CSS, other than just creating images and sticking them in the browser. Also, if you are going to be doing web development, knowing CSS is really important. If you're programming front end and back end, and you can also do CSS, you're what we call a triple threat, because you can really do all aspects of the development pipeline. Just an example of a page with CSS and a page without CSS, you can see that the difference is huge, right? It's a huge advantage if you can get your page to look more pleasing. It's going to be a lot easier for people to end up using. So let's go over some terms. First of all, what we're looking at here is considered a CSS rule, which is a selector and a declaration. So here we've got two declarations and our selector. Here we've got our selector, and we'll talk about the details of what each of these are and how this is going to determine what ends up getting selected. Here we have a combinator, and this combinator specifies that we need to have a link tag, which is in the hover state, which is directly below a list item. Which is below, but doesn't necessarily have to be directly below an article. So we'll explain all these terms. Here we have a property, and here we have a value. And here we actually have a keyword. So the way that this rule example works is to specify that we're going to apply these styles to these selectors, any elements that match the selector, even if they end up getting added to the DOM afterwards. This is something that's considered declarative in the sense that you're declaring what your rules are, and your browser is going to end up implementing these rules. So let's talk about selectors in a bit more detail. There's a number of different selectors that we could have. We could have tags, classes, IDs, attributes, pseudo elements, and also pseudo classes, as well as one that matches everything. So again, it's important to know how these selectors work. So here are examples of each of these selectors, and obviously you could have combinations of these things. So a tag would basically just match the tag of an element, like input. The class btn would end up matching a class. Here the ID upload is going to be an ID selector. You could also match by attribute. There's pseudo elements, which are interesting, and they one of the things that they end up getting used for is they give you the ability to add elements in between elements. I know that this sounds a little bit weird, but they allow you to do some interesting things, like specify that you want to do a clear fix between something that's floating, and you could do that by adding a pseudo element or specifying a pseudo element in relation to that other tag. So that's something that we could look at. A pseudo class is a little bit more behavior driven, so you could have a pseudo class where you specify either hover or active or visited. A lot of times they end up getting used with links. So this is this is an example of all the different types of selectors that we'll use. We spoke a little bit about combinators before. So if you basically wanted to specify that your selector was going to be a descendant of another selector, you would end up doing that with a space. So for instance, if you had a div tag, if you had div space p, you're specifying that you have a paragraph tag which is descendant of the div tag. you could get a little bit more specific and say that it's got to be a direct child, so that in which case you would say div greater than p, where the paragraph tag would be directly below the div tag. You could also specify that a tag should be a next sibling. So if you had div plus p, you would be saying, hey, look, the div and the p tag are on the same level, and the p tag has to be directly after the div tag. You could get a little bit more general by saying, if you said div tilde p, you'd be saying that the p tag is a sibling of the div tag, but it doesn't have to be a direct descendant. And these are all simple examples that you can end up doing pretty easily by popping up in a browser. There's also a W3 site, W3 school site, which allows you to go in here and sort of play with some of these rules. So by looking at these combinators, something that looks fairly similar, there's actually pretty big differences. These spaces matter of these first two. So for instance, this would be where you have an element that has both the tag and the class. This would be an element that has the class whose ancestor is the tag. So something with an element with this class would have to be below the tag. We've got the comma here, which specifies that this rule would end up applying to either a tag or the class. And we've got the plus that we mentioned before, which is basically that you have a sibling of the tag. Sorry for the sirens out there. And again, not just a sibling, but it's got to be the next sibling. So again, an example that we sort of think about here, if we had div plus dot title, right? We'd have to have an element with the class of title, which was directly next to our tag. So again, these are all things that you could probably demonstrate a little bit easier by example. One of the things that you run into when you end up looking at CSS is the fact that the styles are cascading. So we want to take a look and see really what rules end up winning out when we end up thinking about our styles. So let's talk in a little bit more detail about what this means. As an example, let's say that we had a div with an ID of thing. So we could have a style sheet that specifies that the div, there's a rule that says that with a div, the background is going to be red, but we could also have another rule that specifies that if the ID is thing, the background is going to be blue. So obviously this tag ends up adhering to both of those. So the question is, which rule will end up winning? In this case, the ID is going to end up winning because it's considered to be more specific, and so in this case, the background would be blue. Well, let's take another example here. We've got the same rule for the div, where the rule says that if you're a div, your background should end up being red, but we also have another rule that specifies that if you're a tag and your class is foo, your background should be green. So who ends up winning here? Well, what ends up winning here is going to be the class, and the reason for that is that the class is more specific than just the tag. So here's another example that we have here where we're specifying that if you are both foo and bar, your background should be green. And we have our ID rule that specifies that if your ID is thing, your background should be blue. And you might end up thinking that, well, I've got two classes here that end up matching this tag. That's got to hold a lot more weight, but it's actually ID, which is considered more specific. So here's another example. And in this case, we have our same rule that specifies that if your ID is thing, your background is going to be blue. And we've got another rule here that says, and again, notice the space here, which is important. If you are an element with a class of foo and your ancestor is an element with a class of outer, your background should be green. So the question is, which one wins here? And the answer that's kind of interesting is actually the orange. And the reason for that is that inline styles end up trumping IDs. So very often you'll see that if you're trying to override something that's in a style sheet, even though it's an ID, you'll end up doing this inline. Usually this is done more as a fix, a quick fix than anything else. And eventually you're going to want to take your styles and put them in your style sheet. So here's another example here where we've got a div, which again has been pretty general, and we've got this, our example here where we've got, again, this idea that if you're an element with a class of foo and your ancestor is an element with a class of outer, you should be green, which again is fairly specific, but in this case the div wins, and the reason for that is that we're specifying that this is important. So here's another example that we have. So our example here is that we specify on the left that if you are an ID of thing and your ancestor is a class of outer, you should be purple, which this matches, right? We've got an ID of thing, and our outer class is an ancestor that is outer. And here we've got another style that says if you're an ID of profile, a better way to read is from the inside. If you are a class of foo and you have an ancestor which is an ID of profile, you should end up being brown. And so this is a little less clear. And what it comes down to is that which rule was defined last. The last one in ends up winning. So if we were to go and look at these rules, we would see that important is going to be the most important, followed by inline, followed by ID, followed by class, followed by tag, followed by order. And what also fits into this is that when we look at the pseudo element is going to fall into the same category of tag, and also the attribute and the pseudo class would fall in the same category as class. And the other thing is that these combinators don't end up affecting the specificity. So if we end up, going through this list, we could specify, look, if the rule says that it's important, it's going to end up winning. If it doesn't have important, we end up looking at inline. If it has one of the ID selectors, we end up using that, and so on and so forth until we end up, moving down the chain. So this gives you an idea of, which class, which selector or which rule is going to end up winning out. So let's talk a little bit about browser compatibility. In particular, let's talk about how browsers, by default, can implement things like determining the width and the height of elements. And this becomes a little bit problematic because different browsers end up implementing them in different ways. As a result of that, we want to normalize that behavior. And we end up doing this with a style sheet that ends up resetting how the browser ends up handling the width and the height of elements. There's other things that you can reset as well, but this is usually done with a style sheet that is either called reset or something along those lines. And we call this CSS normalization, where we're using a style sheet to make the browsers compatible with each other. So one of the things that we'll run into is that in CSS, really, this is a quote by one of the instructors, Joe, and it's important to think about, is that everything the DOM really is a rectangle. And if you think about that, it sort of helps when you're sort of planning your layout. Even with a complex layout, everything's going to be a rectangle, but you might have this sort of complicated structure with rectangles within other rectangles. And that leads us to this compatibility issue, which is the box model, and that's one of the things that we normalize. So there's a couple of different ways that this ends up getting approached, but if we end up thinking about a box within CSS, you have your content, you have your padding, you have your border, and you even have some space outside of that container or that box, which would be considered the margin. So when you have your box sizing, and this will usually be set up with your star element to say, hey, look, I'm going to handle the width and the height the same. and I want to modify how the browser would normally end up interpreting this. But with the content box model, the width and the height is going to be just that, the width and the height of your content, not taking into account padding, border, or margin. As opposed to the padding box model, where you're going to take into account your content and your padding, but that's it. No border, no margin. And the border box, which is probably a little bit more natural, where you say that your width and your height is going to be your content, your padding, as well as your border. So the box model, we could also think about it as being fractal, where you basically have these boxes that are inside of other boxes. So when we end up thinking about the fact that these elements on our page are boxes, it's not totally true for all elements, because some elements will be will render as blocks, where others will render in line. Every time you put a link in HTML, you notice they'll display next to each other, as opposed to giving themselves the full width of the browser, as opposed to if you put an H1 tag and an H2 tag, the H1 tag is going to have a height, and it's going to have a width, which is going to go all the way across the screen. And so, these things are going to display one on top of the other. And so here you have, how the browser, some elements are naturally will render block, others will, and I should say not naturally, but by default, other elements will by default end up rendering inline, and some will have sort of a combination of both, which would be these other tags over here on the right. That doesn't mean that you cannot override them, and that's something that you might end up doing. I mean, for instance, we could take the case of, we ended up looking at creating a delete button, and the fact that we wanted to do a delete, and we wanted it to be a post request, even though we were using method override. As a result of that, we would need to put our button inside of a form. But if you didn't want that form to take up, width and height, and you wanted that, even though you wanted that delete button to be within a form, you could basically specify, hey, look, I want to take this form, and I want to set its display as inline as opposed to block. So this is something that you could always end up overriding. So let's look at this in a little bit more detail. So we have these three type of elements. And when we think about block level elements, right, these end up going across the screen, usually at 100%, or this is something that you can end up modifying. But the bottom line is that they have their own width and height, and they have their own margins. And again, they're just that. They're block elements. As opposed to if we end up looking at inline style, right? And this would be, again, something like a span or something like a link, where they don't really have their own width and they don't have their own height, and they're really in line with other elements. And you have also inline block, where you can end up setting the margins. They do have a width and height, but they're not really taking up 100% of the screen. And again, if they end up having a width and a height, they'll end up other inline block elements can end up getting pushed down based upon their width and height. So again, these are three different ways that the display can be set differently. So you have block, you have inline, and you have this sort of combination of inline block. And when we end up talking about width and height, and we end up setting them, we have to give them some units. So a very common one is to have a unit of pixel. Another one is to use some percentage, which is going to be a percentage of whatever the parent element is. We could also specify them as M, where that's going to have to do with the whatever the current font size is. And M, this term is a typography term, which has to do with the width of whatever a capital M would end up being. There's a couple of other ones which I'm a little bit less familiar with, but some of these have to do with the vertical width and the vertical height. These last three I really have had very little use for, but could be interesting to investigate. And there's some other ones as well. So it's important, that when you end up specifying a width and a height, that you end up doing so with units. The only time you don't have to do that is that if you're going to have a padding of 0, you don't have to put 0 pixels. You can end up putting 0. You could put 0 pixels, but it's a little bit redundant. So again, if someone's looking at your CSS, it would be a little bit cleaner if you did have 0, if you didn't end up putting those units in. So the next thing we're going to take a look at is another area which could be a little bit confusing, which is how elements end up floating to create some interesting layouts. So let's talk about how floats end up working. So this is a cute little quote. Someone says they understand floats. They're probably lying a little bit because they tend to be confusing. So let's take a look at, here's an example where you have two block elements and you have something that's floating to the right. And really, that's exactly what it's doing. It's just going to end up floating to the right, and it's basically floating on top of these other two elements. Now, if you didn't want this type of behavior, what you could end up doing, if you didn't want this element floating above this lower block element, one of the things that you could end up doing is you could specify that you want to clear this float that's on the right. So you have this div which is floating on the right, and you're clearing it, and this way you don't have this element that's below it being covered up. So this is one of the things that you'll run into where, it's you can figure out when you want things to float, but sometimes it can be a little bit more confusing to figure out how you want things to clear. So floats were originally intended for wrapping text, maybe wrapping them around an image, but they also end up getting used to create this sort of grid and column layout. But the one thing that you have to be aware of is that you have to clear your fixes so that you avoid this collapsing happening. So we'll talk a little bit about what that means, and we'll give you a visual for that. So here's an example of, we have this div. Within this div, we're going to be floating left with a width of 70%, and we've got this other div which is going to be green, and within it we've got a span. So we've got something that's in line. So if we look at this, we have this orange rectangle, right, which is floating left. And as a result of that, we've got this green div, which we'll see is actually going to be behind it. And so we can look at it from a little bit of a different perspective if we end up actually looking at this as boxes and see how we end up getting this type of behavior. And the fact that we have this sort of green div that's behind here that really is collapsing. So if we end up looking at this sort of step by step, what really ends up happening, if we think about these without the float, we've got this orange div that's sitting inside this box at 70% of the width. We've got this green div which is going across 100%, and we've got this span which just takes up its content really, which is what inline elements end up doing. So if we end up saying that the orange is going to float, let's think about it as sort of coming, floating on top of this box. And as a result of this, we get this collapse where the green ends up going behind it. So you can end up getting content that's lost behind this, this orange div that's floating. But inline elements float, are buoyant. So any sort of inline elements will end up floating up over here, and they wrap around the floated one. So the issue that you sort of run into, if there was any sort of content on the left in the green, it would be covered up. So what you can end up doing, so you could sort of see this from this perspective, where here's the floating as boxes, and here's the what your result ends up being. And so this could be something that you want to avoid. So here again, you could see that the green div is basically sitting here behind the other one, and that's where your missing content is going to end up going. Avoided by actually clearing your floats. So this is something that you can end up dealing with when you end up creating your own grid system. So again, you have this situation where you want to avoid having content that you want to show collapsing behind other elements. And this is one of the things that gets to be a little bit frustrating and makes CSS feel a little bit magical. So this is actually where you run into these pseudo elements. So you could specify that if you have a class of clearfix, you could actually put some content in there. And basically you're clearing the floats so you don't have this situation coming up. And you could do this in a before or after, and these are the pseudo elements that we ended up speaking about before. And this is where you'll end up running into that. So it could actually be a little bit of a little bit confusing sometimes. Here's a slide that sort of demonstrates this, where you sort of keep on fixing things, and so it could be a little bit of a challenge. So to deal with that challenge, we're going to add a little bit more to this alphabet soup. So you have CSS, and what we have is SCSS. It's also if you end up seeing this, people will call this sass, and this is actually stands for syntactically awesome style sheets. So what this actually does is what sass does is it adds a level of programming to style sheets, so that within your sass you can have concepts of nesting, variables, loops, functions, and modules, all really giving you the ability to have some reusability, and let's be clear about that, some maintainability of style sheets. And how does it work? Well, really what this falls under the category of, and we really haven't seen this up to this point, is actually something called transpiling. So where the sass actually compiles to CSS. So the browser itself has no ability to deal with sass or the idea of variables, that sort of thing in style sheets. But what ends up happening is that our sass file gets compiled, or transpiled is another word for it, into actual CSS. And so when you end up writing your sass, you could do something like this. So this would not be valid CSS. You can't nest CSS. And what we're saying here is that this rule reads fairly well. It says, if you're an article tag, we're going to give you a border of 1 pixel solid in red. And within that, if you're a list item, we're going to end up giving you a background of gray. And what that ends up doing here is that this will end up compiling to this, which, again, is the whole idea of specifying that if you are a list item underneath an article tag, you're going to have a background of gray, but the article tag itself is going to have a 1 pixel solid red. So where CSS doesn't end up giving you nesting, sass does. And again, the browser is not going to understand what's on the left, but the browser will understand what's on the right, and that's what your sass is transpiled to. So another example here of variables. So instead of actually having the same color all over the place in your style sheet, you could specify a variable for it. And again, one of the things that this is doing, where this maybe gives you some advantage in terms of readability, this really gives you an advantage in maintainability. where if you decided to change what the RGB values were for your color, you could do that in one spot. And again, this will end up getting transpiled to what you end up seeing on the right. You also have the ability to do loops. We're going to end up using this for our columns. So, for instance, you could end up looping, and again, Sass has its own language and syntax built into it. It's something that takes a little bit of getting used to and a little bit of context switching. But the idea is that what's on the left is going to end up turning into what's on the right. So again, the whole idea here is that you have something that's more maintainable. You could imagine, here you're just looping from 1 to 3, but if you were, looping over 12 column values or that sort of thing, this is something that would be a lot easier with Sass. Sass also has the concept of mix-ins, so that if you are doing something similar with CSS, you can actually create a function for it, so that here we could specify we want to include this border radius mix-in, and we want to pass in this value of 10 pixels, which is like a parameter that's going into a function, and this will end up transpiling to what you end up seeing on the right. So again, it gives you the real ability to maintain your style sheets. You can also have the ability to pull in other style sheets by importing them. And literally what that'll do is that'll end up bringing in another style sheet. So it gives you the ability to separate out your style sheets. And one of the things that does, instead of having this sort of monolithic style sheet, you could break it out into different sections. And that's going to go a long way in terms of maintaining the CSS of your application, which is something you really want to do, because if you can't maintain it, you can end up being stuck with the same design. So one of the other challenges that you're going to run into is that your application might look good on as you're coding it on your desktop, but then all of a sudden when someone ends up browsing on an iPhone or a tablet or a bigger screen, it'll end up looking terrible. And this is really where responsive design ends up coming in. So you could imagine having to test for, every single possible device, which really is going to be impossible, but you can end up getting fairly close. And there are some tools that allow you to do this. So what you really want to do is make your site fully functional for, as many different screen sizes, resolutions, and orientations. And obviously, this is born out of necessity, because you can't control how someone is going to be looking at your site. Different people have different devices. The same person could end up viewing your site on different devices. So it's something that you have to address. So what you really want to do is you're catering to your user. It used to be that you would see that you'd see messages like you see on the bottom that only certain browsers would end up displaying properly, and that could be that maybe only certain browsers ended up implementing the CSS that you were using. That's not something that you want to do. So this is actually a humorous slide which sort of deals with the fact that people were trying to make their sites compliant with Internet Explorer, and I'm sort of forgetting the version by now, but there was almost a rejoicing when some of the modern companies said, hey, look, we're no longer going to support, and I think it was like Internet Explorer 6 or something along those lines, because there was all kinds of fixes that you had to put in, because it was still, there was still a decent number of users that were using it. But at some point, that number sort of dwindled and people were happy, but you still have to deal with different devices that people are using. So a couple of steps that you could take to make your site more responsive. One of the first things that you want to do is that you want to actually put a meta tag on your screen. So you can actually set your viewport so that things will actually scale properly on a mobile device. So this is sort of the first thing that you want to do. It'll be fine for other devices as well, but it's something that's really imperative if you're going to be if you want people to end up not seeing a tiny site when they browse to your site on a mobile device. And the second thing that you want to do is you want to end up adding media queries. So media queries basically allow you to target different screen sizes and different resolutions. So, in this case, you could specify your CSS styles this would work for tablets, where the maximum width was 980 pixels. So one sort of method which works pretty well in terms of doing this is to actually set your default styles outside of the media queries. So I would say for larger devices, and then sort of tailor them to change the CSS as the devices get smaller. And you could end up adding these media query tags to separate CSS files. And again, we've seen how sass could end up importing those CSS files. So here's an example of what some media queries look like. So here would be if you were targeting, anything that was greater than 900 pixels. Here, CSS class would apply if your viewing area was between 600 pixels and 900 pixels. And here you could actually even target specific devices where you're actually looking at the width of the device. And again, this is dealing with the resolution of the device as opposed to the viewing area that you're looking at. If you wanted to determine or detect whether something was in portrait or landscape, you could end up doing that as well, and you could end up, bringing in these different style sheets based upon whether or not, someone was looking at it in the portrait or landscape mode. So we've covered a lot here. We've spoken about what role CSS plays, broken down what the different terms are in terms of the CSS rules, spoke about how the rules apply in terms of which rules end up winning, how the floats work, what role box model plays, how to make our CSS more maintainable by using transpiling with a tool like sass, and also how to make our sites available to more users by making them responsive, so they end up looking good on any number of devices that a user might end up browsing to your site with. So there's a lot of other material that you could go into. So if this stuff interests you, you could look up any one of these topics and dig down a little bit deeper. But this, what we've gone over so far, should be enough to get you through the workshop, where you're going to basically be using all the material that we've gone over so far to build your own version of the Bootstrap library.